piece I'd like to talk about today is mediation and conflict resolution using clean language and systemic modelling. The way I'll talk about it is to use an example, but the process is really quite generic and it can be used from conflict resolution in an ongoing team when something's just come up, or it can be used, as in this example, where there's been a long-standing series of disputes that's reached a peak and they've brought in an outsider to resolve the conflict rather than it, to go further down a disciplinary procedure. So one of the first things I'm thinking about when I go into conflict resolution is what are the series of misunderstandings and miscommunications that inevitably will have gone on? How do I create enough rapport with the people, say the two people involved, so that they know that they're being heard and listened to, and at the same time I'm creating some space between what they already think, what they already believe, and what else could be true, so that by the time I've got them in the room together, there's already two things going on. They know that I'm really listening to them, they know that I can advocate for their point of view, and at the same time there's a loosening or an interest or an inquiry into what's going on for the other person and what would they really like to have happen. So I tend to do that. It depends on the budget of the client. Ideally, I would see both people individually twice, and then I'd see them together twice. But in the example I'm going to give you, I had a phone call with each of the people. So I'd talk to them. I'd start with what's going on, what's the situation, and it's a bit like a semi-structured clean interview. They say whatever they say, and I ask clean questions to say currently it's like what. How did it start? Then what happened? Then what happened? What happened just before that? Then what are some of the potential consequences? So with each, the telephone conversations are a mini modelling project. So I do it for this client, I do it for this client, I transcribe the interviews, I tidy them up, send them back, check that that's what they did say. And then I say to them, now send me back a version that you're happy for the other person to see. So I then share them back across so they read each other's, and then I go back again, second interview, and I say, that's what's going on for you, this is what's going on for you. If this mediation session was to go just the way you'd like it to, it will be like what? I model that out, say, when the mediation session goes just as you'd like it to be, you're going to need to be like what? And what support or resources do you need from me and from the other person so that you can be at your best and the session can go as well as you'd like it to. Do the same for these guys, and then I, again, transcribe them, swap them over, get them to read each other's, and then we bring them together. So the clean questions do a really interesting job with all of this, is because they use only the language that the person's used, they are really affirming. And because they then ask for adjacent information, they create space. So for example, if they say, she's constantly been undermining me in meetings. So when she's constantly been undermining you, what kind of undermining? Well, she asks me for bits of information that she knows I don't have. So when she asks you for bits of information that she knows you don't have, what kind of information is that? Well, really minuscule details. It's like I'm being micromanaged. Okay, so she asks minuscule details like you're being micromanaged. And what lets you know that she knows that you don't have that information? Well, people just don't carry that kind of information around with them. It's just not necessary. There's no need for her to know that. Okay, so it's not that I'm trying to change his mind, but I'll constantly be asking for a little bit more information, some clarification, and then what's the evidence, what's he making up about it, and what's the impact? So with each piece of information, it's always, how do you know? What have you seen and heard? What are you making up about it? What's the impact on you? And the same with them. How do you know? What's the evidence? What are you making up about it? What's the impact on you? So what they're going to be used to, I'm already training their attention on giving me that kind of information. And then when I bring them into the room together, it's very similar. So they'll have done a clean setup. You'd like the session to be like what? You'd like to be like what? What resources of support do you want from each other? When I bring them together, I start that again. So it's something they're already familiar with. I say, okay, you've read each other's stuff. For this session to go just the way you'd like it to be, it'll be like what? What would you like? What would you like? You want to be like what? You want to be like what? What supportive resources do you need? What supportive resources do you need? And I start to encourage them at that stage to ask one another clarification questions. So when she says that she'd like you to be honest, I say, so what will you say or hear that will let you know that he's being honest? Oh, well, there'll be no beating around the bush. He'll just be saying it straight. So, got any questions for clarification? He says, yeah, well, what if I'm beating around the bush because I don't really know, I'm just like thinking things through? She'll say, well, that's okay. But what you're doing is you're starting to build up this little mediation, not about the issues, but about the way that we're going to run that session. And the closer I can get that working well, the more I'm sure that I'll be able to hold the rest of the information clearly. Now with this, the example I'm thinking about, it was really interesting because it didn't really make sense to me. When I interviewed them, and then I read through their transcripts, I thought there doesn't seem to be a clear indication about what's going wrong between them. But then when I watched them, something started to occur to me. So you're not just helping them speak to each other, you're not just helping them to pay attention to one another, you're also tracking patterns. And I noticed a couple of things. I noticed that a lot of his issue with her was about detail, micromanagement, detailed information. And then her issues about him was that she felt that he was withholding information. I kept thinking, there's something going on here that I just can't quite get. And then it just occurred to me to ask her something else. I said, just stop a second. So I said to her, if you think about a team member in your team, just think about them now. She said, yeah. I said, what do you know about them? She said, what do you mean? I said, what level of detail? What could you tell me? Just give me a little synopsis. She said, well, I could tell you. She said, what do you mean, like their birth date? Do you mean like whether they've got children or not? Do you mean like where they are in their training at work? Do you mean what their plans are? Do you mean what projects they're involved in? So let me just check. So you know, you can go into one person in your team and you know their birth date, their children, projects, their training. She said, well, of course I do. So okay, just stop. I want you to think about a member of your team. I said, what level of detail? He said, well, I can think of somebody. I kind of know what project they're on. I said, anything else? He said, well, I've got it all in notes. And what I realised just by listening to the way that they talk, what I then got them to really clarify for each other, is that she has an extraordinary capacity to keep huge amounts of detailed information in a system. And she makes sense of things by keeping huge tracts of information and then cross-referencing them. When they'd worked together, he's very sociable in the moment, very into people, very able to interact with them, very able to persuade and build rapport in the moment, which is not her strength at all. When they'd worked together at the same level, they'd been fantastic partnership. When she got promoted into a new position, so her patterns were exacerbated because she had a new role and people to manage. What she needed from him now, or she kept demanding from him, detail that he doesn't keep in his system. His system is very present and in the moment and able to interact, and he keeps all the detail as filing. So every time she asked him for a piece of information, he'd have to go and look it up and come back to her. In that interim, she thinks he's got the information because she would, and he just won't give it to her. She thinks he's deliberately delaying it. And this, what had started, what was actually a neurodiversity issue, had started to be misunderstood, misrepresented, and had escalated until he wouldn't tell her anything. So now he was doing what she imagined he was doing before. He is doing it now. But none of it was necessary. And it's in that sort of realisation, they were like, oh, for goodness sake, do you mean, when you say this, do you actually just want this? She said, oh, yeah, I need you to feed all that information. She said, well, not from me. How else could she get that information? There are other people who know it, or she would be quite happy to take it electronically. So there's lots of ways it could be resolved. And then once it was resolved, what you're looking for is what's the least you have to do as a clean facilitator, so that then they start unpacking their issues themselves, which is what these two started. They really didn't need me at that point. I could just skip off. And then I came back in again later and 6 months later as well, to just check, was everything okay? Yes, everything was fine. Did they need me in again? No, actually, they were able to resolve it themselves. That was fine. Now, that was where the conflict was neurodiversity. There are other areas that I get brought into where it's not neurodiversity, as in it's not to do with a different thinking pattern. It might be different beliefs or it might be because there's mismanagement at a higher level. But the process is always the same. Find out who's involved. So if it is issues at a higher level, then you'll need to get that person in as well. Questions, currently it's like what, and then you use the clean questions to go, it's like what, how do you know it's like that, what's your evidence, what's your inference, what are you making up about it, what's the impact, and then where did it come from, where does it go to, so use the clean questions to expand it, transcribe, send it back, check that they agree with it, swap them over so they can read each other's, do it again, a second iteration, so that on the third iteration they're aware of the way each of them's coming from and there's space for them to start to collaborate.